Talrico! Oh, it is a miracle! Everybody sing!
And we're now into episode 6 of the Hot Tub Rugby League Time Machine, and he was so good in the hot tub with me last time. We had to get the great fella back. Albert Talrico. Alby, how are you, my friend? What's happening?
Well, King Curtis, it's great to be back on the Hot Tub Time Machine. I'm about to put it up to a nice temperature, about to hop in there, and we'll talk about some of the old days.
Yeah, so we're about to go back to 2010, which I'm sure is still very fresh in your memory as well, mate. But before we get into that, You've got another podcast on the go. Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, well, we've just started a podcast. We're up to episode, I think, 19. So we've been going for a little bit now. It's called The Front Office. It's more business related. We do have some interesting guests on the program talking about rugby league. We've talked to a couple of chief executive officers, a few commercial officers, and it's based around the Jack Gibson saying that winning starts in the front office. So we started that out, and we've spoken to board members and chairmen and ex-chairpersons, and it's really quite insightful. And not just in rugby league. We spoke to the basketball guy. We spoke to also netball, Netball Australia. So we've had some really, really interesting people. A couple of favourites, Yvonne Sampson and Lara Pitt were great. This week we had the great Jimmy Jack number one back, just to talk a little bit about history as well. We've been focusing a little bit on West Tigers of late, just to see where they are. Where they are in the cycle of rugby league, because rugby league, always seems to happen in cycles, unless you're Melbourne, where you buy a premiership or a big cap, unlike the Roosters. Yeah. And we'll talk about the big cap in the Roosters in a moment. But it's just interesting to see how every club goes and to try and pinpoint where we are in time. And I think that's interesting to see as well.
Where can you find this podcast, The Front Office?
Apple, the Apple Podcast, Podbean, and Spotify.
Podbean. So you did follow. So I did give you some good advice. I assume that was me.
Yeah, and it worked real good. It's done good.
No, exactly right. And that's where you can find Hot Tub Rugby League Time Machine and Top of the Props as well. Alby, there's no secret that you are originally a St. George Dragons fan, and for the Steelers out there too, because I know there's some Steelers diehards out there. And I will be speaking to Luke Potter about the final years of the Steelers as well. In a week or two. But you obviously now a St. George Illawarra Dragons supporter. When I think of the Dragons in the early 2000s leading into, I guess, the Bennett era, if you want to call it that, they were always there. They were either the premiership favourites, they were either minor premiers, or they were always in a prelim final. They were a stacked team, but they just couldn't get there. And we will talk about this as we go along. And the choking and all this other stuff that other people have used over the years. Did it become a thing with Dragons fans as well? Like, obviously, and off the back of the 90s, where they lost, 4 grand finals?
4 grand finals,
Was there a psyche within the supporter base that, let's just close our eyes and wake up when we've won a premiership and just get it out of the way?
Yeah, I mean, I've been on the hill many times out of Cogra, and the 90s was a great decade for St. George. We had a great success in the 90s. Once we merged with Illawarra and became the St. George Illawarra Dragons, we started out with great success. In 1999, made the grand final against Melbourne, a new club that had only been into its second year. And they ended up in the grand final together, and everyone thought St. George were going to do it. But, like always, Billy Harrigan, when he blows his whistle and then he puts it away in the final 20 minutes of the second half, and Melbourne got the roll and got the momentum, and that was the end of that. But St. George always tried in the 2000s. As you said, we were up there with David Waite and Andrew Farrer and Nathan Brown. We almost quite got there, and it was like the great Tony Dozen saying, it's like getting that nice girl on a dance floor at the Ivy at 3 a.m. so close yet so far. And we cop so much grief as supporters about being chokers, especially 2009. 2009, St George were on the right. They were on the right precipice. They had the right momentum. Bennett had got the finals right, well, except for one bloke called Jared Hayne, and he just toyed with St George. And when they replay that, it churns my stomach. And I remember where I was at the time, and the amount of people that would just give to us. And as soon as he scored, it was all over. And St George had nothing to give.
You talk about, I guess, a lot of the fan base these days. There's a running joke within Dragon supporters about jobs for the boys and
Yes.
Coaches that may or may not be ready to coach first grade, but somehow they land a job at the Dragons.
Yes.
Was Nathan Brown too young? Was he the wrong choice for that team when he got given that coaching role in the 2000s?
At the time, I thought they rushed him. Yeah, absolutely. Now, I still say it. I really believe Nathan Brown will one day get a premiership. I really believe that. But it's going to be some time away. I mean, Nathan Brown, he came under that Brian Smith regime there. He learnt a lot from Brian. He learnt a lot from David Waite. Learnt a lot from Andrew Farrar. And then when he did his own thing, and he did very well in the minors, did fantastic. And I think they were hoping for a miracle, just like Canterbury did with Ricky Stewart. Ricky Stewart won the reserve grade competition with Canterbury, got offered the job with the Roosters to replace Murray, and all of a sudden he created history. Now, they were in 3 grand finals in the early 2000s. They were hoping for that miracle. It never came. And I think they were very close. I mean, everyone said, we bought our tickets for 2005. I did it. I waited. And I just knew. And then they faced off against Benji's Tigers. Benji and Robbie's Tigers.
I forgot about that game, Alby.
Yeah, no, well, I haven't. But we got our revenge 5 years later. We'll come to that in a second.
We will.
But, that was one of those interesting games. Again, the momentum was all Tigers. And I'll never forget, there was a bloke that had $500 on the Swans into the Tigers. And he was scheduled to win, I think, close to $1 million. And so they convinced him to cash out at $450, but keep the bet moving forward for the game afterwards, which was the Tigers. And he would have won, quite a thing, but I think they convinced him because it would have been a huge payout. But I suppose they put the fear of loss into him, and had he stayed strong, he would have walked away with I think 2.9 million, if memory serves me right.
It's a lot.
But one of those things, good punter, good on him. I think it was 30-1 into 25-1. So, good luck to him for doing something like that. But the issue with St George again in towards that middle to late 2000s is that they just couldn't get into their mindset. And that's been St George Illawarra problem for as long as can remember. We've had great reserve grade coaches coach first grade, great reserve grade coaches. We've almost got there, but there's a mindset. And when Wayne Bennett came to St George, he said the first thing he said is, I've got men that want to win. They just don't know how. I'll show them how. They will win. And that they did.
13th in 2007, 7th in 2008. Bennett comes along in 2009, and the gains for the guys they've already got at the club, and I'll touch on them in a second, but the gains for 2009, Darius Boyd, Neville Costigan, Jeremy Smith from the Storm, Mick Wayman from Canberra, Nathan Fiend from the Warriors, and you add that to a squad that's already got Cooper, I think Gasni's gone by now, Cooper, Cray, Hormy, Brett Morris, Nottingale, guys like Justin Poore, quality player at the time, Pryor, Scott, Jamie Sow, Dean Young. From day one, 2009, there are no excuses for the Dragons not to be at least there on grand final day.
There are no excuses, but you notice what they've bought. What he brought to the club. They were not superstars. They were all very good tradesmen that knew how to play the game, but they also had good experience on their side. Michael Wayman's from the south coast of New South Wales. He's from Maruya. Costigan came to the club. They all knew how to get that to grind a victory. And Darius Boyd was probably at the top of his game when he came to St George in 2009, and he was ready to just go on fire. And he did. He was just fantastic for St George. He added something that had been lacking at fullback for such a long time, but he found it. And he worked well, of course, with Wayne Bennett. And there's always lots of jokes about him and Wayne Bennett, of course. But saying that, he was the spark that St George needed. But the thing about St George was that Ben Hornby was the captain, and he ended up becoming the Wayne Bennett on the field. He looked like Wayne Bennett. He sounded like Wayne Bennett. And what he's doing now at South Sydney with his coaching career in, I think, the Flag or something like that, I think Ben Hornby could be the next the next big thing in coaching, you know, along with that new breed of Holbrook and Demetrio.
As long as he's not rushed. But
Well, I think he's going. He left home to go and get more experience. It's like going overseas and getting to the job, and he did the right thing. And I think he realised that things weren't happening. But yeah, we'll talk about that again later too.
Dragons, as you mentioned, they finished 2009 as minor premiers.
Yes.
Bit of deja vu for Dragons fans. They go out in straight sets. A great team, and Wayne Bennett has already done everything in the game. But I've got a sense, and I'm sure I've read it somewhere before. I may have even written it somewhere as well. Wayne Bennett, his idols, Jack Gibson, and to a lesser extent, or to a more of an extent, Ron Massey. Gibson went off to other clubs, and I think Bennett always wanted to coach in Sydney.
He did.
And he always wanted to do that. He almost never got to Cogra. Now most of us know the story now, but he had an agreement. He shook hands with Nick Politis. He was going to be the Roosters coach before that, wasn't he?
When Wayne Bennett wanted to challenge himself, he wanted to come to Sydney because he felt he'd done absolutely everything he could do at the Broncos. And the story that I heard that he'd sounded out two clubs. One was the Roosters, the other was St. George. Anyway, the Roosters story, he was going to stay until he got cold feet at the last moment, as long as it didn't leak. And that was his proviso. Well, it leaked, and the story broke. And so Broncos approached him, and he said, I'm not going anywhere. He re-signed again, and he stayed there. And that upset Nick Politis a lot, and they ended up with Chris Anderson into Brad Fittler. And I think it really hurt their ego around that time as well. St. George came available. Roosters weren't interested, but Politis wasn't interested. He wasn't going to get him back there. No way in the world. So St. George became available. And, you know, they said, here's the checkbook, write your number, bring us the premiership. And that was his instructions, was to get a premiership. And you talk about him and Jack Gibson and Ron Massey. Now, Jack Gibson, everyone calls him the master coach, and he was. He won 5 premierships. Massey. Wayne Bennett's won more. Yeah. But Jack's done it at 2 clubs. Wayne Bennett's done it at 2 clubs. But no one else has done it at 3. Now, Wayne Bennett's at Souths. And this year, even though they're just outside the top 4, they are, I really believe, the nuisance sides. It's either this year or next year for Souths. And they're going to be talking about Wayne going up to Queensland. Sure, he'll do Origin. I've got no doubt about that. But now that coaching role's sorted up at Brisbane, Wayne ain't going anywhere. Wayne will wait. He may end up being the Queensland coach again the year after next, but he's going to see out his contract at Souths. I had that mail some months ago, and from very high sources, and he realises what he's building there. He will then become an immortal of a coach if he can get Souths another premiership. It'll be one coach, 3 different clubs.
Well, let's hope for Jason Demetriou's sake he does it pretty soon. But do you think at the end of 2009, Alby, now Wayne Bennett doesn't sweat much, but he understands his history very well. And I've seen some documentaries where he really goes in depth and really loves the game. He does. He loves the game. Do you think at the end of 2009, he spent 12 months as the St. George Illawarra coach, and yes, again, the merged entity had only been around for, say, 10 years, but I guess that St. George history basically took over most of that Steelers history, rightly or wrongly, with the Red V once they merged. But by the end of 2009, do you think Bennett went, okay, now I can feel the weight of history here? 2010, this is probably my biggest challenge as a coach to date at that point?
Yeah, I think it got to the point where I think he just needed to refocus the guys. And I think they knew how to win, but they just fell out of it. They fell back into old St. George. And it so often happens with St. George's, they fall back into that, she'll be right, mate. And Roy Master said to me, he said, if you hit one forward in St. George, all of them crumble. If you hit one player in St. George, all of them will fold. And he said, it's just a mentality thing at St. George. He said, Wayne Bennett's one of the only ones that's been able to unlock it. And he managed to do it. And he didn't make any major changes to the side in 2010. He got the foundation right. Dean Young was starting to move on fire. He brought back in Nathan Feen. Hornby was going good. When you mentioned Jeremy Smith and Costigan, I mean, these 2 guys were in forces. And with Horse, Michael Wayman charging up, They just did their way, but they protected their line. And you look at that side in 2010 and how many points were scored against them. I think it was 299, if memory serves me correct.
Mm.
And you look, they played 24 games and they had just on 300 points scored against them, which is what, an average of about 12 to 15 points a match.
Yeah, I think it was.
So they allowed in maybe 2 tries a match on average, and yet they scored 4 or 5. They deserved to be in the grand final, and they deserved to on that particular day. But, geez, they gave everyone a fright on the way through. And as with every St George side that's ever won a grand final, there's always a bogey side. And the bogey side that year was Canberra. Canberra beat them twice. Once, of course, at Wollongong, and one at Bruce Stadium.
And there was that ongoing nightmare for the Dragons when they had to take the trip down the Hume Highway to Canberra for years. They just couldn't win there.
Yes.
But I was just going to say, so 2009, the best defence in the competition. They repeat that in 2010. And just from my own memory, which is a little bit easy to talk about this time around because I think I was only 24, so I can remember it like it was yesterday, rather than compare to speak to someone like Keithy Payne talk about 1967 or something like that. But even in 2010, the Dragons were a team that really did use Jamie Soward, a bit like the Bears used to use Jason Taylor. One of their great attacking weapons was the goal kicking of Jamie Soward. And they didn't care if they won 8-4 or they didn't care if they won 10-6. They just grinded teams out, which is crazy to think that Bennett, for all those years, even at Canberra in the late 80s, great attacking team, and then he got the Broncos. And what an attacking force they were. But then all of a sudden he changes everything and he says, right, this is how we're going to win a premiership. We're going to grind teams out. We're going to be boring, and I don't give a shit what other teams think. This is how we're going to win. What a big change that is from the Bennett that we knew leading in to get into the Dragons, and then all of a sudden, his team's kicking penalty goals and boring teams out of it because they trusted the defence so much.
Yeah, he added a dash of Warren Ryan. And what he did was he said, if you're down in that quarter, you come back with something.
Yep.
And then I want you to defend it to the hill, get it back up there, get it to the 40, kick down there, get the ball, bash them, get the ball back, force the error, and it'll take care of itself. Protect your line. I remember Phil Gould going, look at their line. They are not afraid of any attack whatsoever. He goes, this side, he goes, just watch them. They are so confident in their plays. They are not panicking. It was a different St George. And I think the fact is that St George love to be front runners. Never let St George chase down. I mean, I think they've only done it maybe a half a dozen times in my lifetime, to be quite honest, that I can recall. But when they're out in front and they throw the ball around with abandon, watch them play rugby league. Watch, and what is it, the big, is it superlatives? I can't even pronounce the word.
Superlatives.
Yeah, that's the one. And basically they just go on about, Champagne Rugby League and all that sort of stuff because they're out in front. Same thing happened in 99. They get out in front. That's it. Just shut the gate. Let them go. But what they did was they were only getting out in front by 2 and 4 and 6 points, defending their lead, like you said, and they just backed their defence one by one. I mean, they relied on these tradesmen to do their job. Your Justin Paws. I mean, none of them are superstars at all. You average those players out today. How much would they all be on? Yeah, they get a role here at the Titans, another one at the Warriors and what have you. But together they seem to be able to talk a language that they all understood, and they bought into what Bennett was selling. And I think that was the most important thing.
Dragons, they start 2010 with three straight wins, Parramatta, Canterbury, and the Cowboys. Now, their first litmus test of 2010 is against, at the time, before the Storm got done for their cap cheating, they go down to Melbourne.
I remember it, yes.
And they lose. They're outplayed 17-4. And just to give you a picture of what the media was like to the Dragons back in these days, the Sydney Morning Herald headline from the next day on April 2, Dragons falter again on big stage. And the opening paragraph was, St George Illawarra's ability to perform in big matches is again open to scrutiny after the Dragons' attack relived the nightmare of last year's dismal finals campaign with a lacklustre display in the Good Friday blockbuster against Melbourne. I mean, this is now a real thing. It's gotten to the point where people can almost touch it when they want to bag out the Dragons, or if they ever get into a big game and they don't perform. Like they are whipping boys, even though they're 2010, they're runaway minor premiers. They're still whipping boys when it comes to these big games because they haven't won the big one yet, have they?
No, and they haven't come close. And I remember that game quite vividly. St George have got a horrible record in Melbourne. But strangely enough, however, in the first 1 or 2 years when they used to play against Melbourne, they would come away with the points. But since then, it's been a horrible record. And I remember that game. Melbourne they just grinded St George. They out St George. I mean, it was an ugly win. It wasn't a very attractive game at all. And St George I don't think they really had their mind in the right place. And then, of course, hell broke loose for Melbourne. And I often wonder whether had Melbourne continued on their merry way down to the finals, what would have happened. But, you look at the for and against and what St George were able to do against other clubs as well. And I still think that they would have got there.
So from there, the Dragons, they win the next 4 easily. Broncos, Titans, Roosters, Sharks. And then again, round 9, Manly, the 2007 grand finalists, the 2008 premiers. They are finalists in 2009. There's 17,000 in Brookvale on a Saturday night. Half-time, 10-6 Manly. Manly win 24-6. But in the media, it stated how great the victory was for Manly. They had 8 players from the Anzac Test less than 24 hours earlier, and they still got up and done the job. At this point, what's Wayne Bennett saying to his team? Is he giving it to them? Is he testing them? Or is he saying, don't worry, we'll just keep playing, we'll keep winning?
I think Wayne Bennett at that stage, every now and again, you're going to have a bad night in the office. And let's not forget, St George did have quite a few players that played as well in that match the night before. There was quite a few players that were playing. I think, if memory serves me right, may have been Gasnier, might have been Costigan, that were in, I think even Dean Young maybe. So they had a few players as well. And I think St George became just a tad arrogant, as they often do, and a little bit complacent. Again, Brookvale Oval has never been a happy hunting ground for St George or Illawarra for that matter, and definitely not at St George Illawarra. And, Fortress Brookvale was starting to take shape over on the Northern Beaches.
Dragons, they're running first, and if they didn't need any more help in June, the club announces the return of a fella called Mark Gasnier from French Rugby.
Yes.
No one except Dragons fans really liked this, did they?
Well, the main business is synonymous with rugby league, and I think they wanted to have a change in the guard and to continue on with the generational things to George. And, there was a lot of money on the table for him to come back. The fact that he left the way he did upset a lot of people, and he made a lot of bad comments there about St George. But they opened up the checkbook and they got him back, and Wayne said, set himself into shape, and he did, and he started to perform quite well. He wasn't the same Mark Gasnier that we knew all those years before. He definitely, I thought, had come. He wasn't as strong, I don't feel, because rugby takes a lot of that out in the condition. You know what? And he started to get back to the old Mark Gasnier. It took him a while, but he got there.
When you look at, when I look at back at different premiership winning sides of the past, you sit there and you can bring up certain names and you say, how important was this bloke, or why did this guy, need to be there this year? But you look at the Dragons 2010 team, and maybe this is why other fans and that probably found it easier to give it to them. There weren't charisma players. There wasn't a guy there. There was no Mundine. There was no one there that was, in the media every single day. Like you said, tradesmen.
Exactly. There was no X factor.
Darius Boyd, Darius Boyd and Hornby and these guys, they soured. That they kind of kept to themselves and they were very proper and, straight tie kind of guys. They were stars, but none of them stood out more than the others, did they?
No, not even close. Not even close. And I think that's the mentality that Wayne brings around his sides. But he's been fortunate to have an Alan Lang or a Darren Lockyer. And then all of a sudden, I think things started to turn for Jamie Soward. And when Wayne said to Jamie, I think, it's time for you to run the ball, well, he did. And I think he became that X factor. And he was the fastest man over 20 metres or so, Gus would like us to believe. But, I do know Jamie, and he's still pretty quick. But he brought things to St George. His kicking game was second to none. And you know what? The reason why they've got a set of 7 tackles now is because they would kick the ball out over the dead ball line, wait for the other team on the 20, and bash them before they got to the 50, try and force an error, and then force their way and score a try, or repeat set and then get a try. That's what St George did. And it was all about field possession. And that's the defence all the way. But it's another rule that St George have been involved with over the years that has changed rugby league because St George were able to use it. It makes you wonder about how long it's taken for people to wake up to what Melbourne have been doing. I'll give you an example. In 1966, of course, it was unlimited tackle. St George won all those premierships on the back of the unlimited tackle rule. 1967, it came into being 4 tackles because they took it down from the 4 downs of gridiron. And that changed again back in 1971. Now, in 1971, of course, well, St George lost a grand final to South after a guy called Eric Sims was playing because Eric Sims would kick field goals and they were worth 2 points. So then it became 1 point. So St George have been involved with many of the rules changes over the years. And this was another one, 7 tackle sets. That's because St George will kick it out over the dead ball line. And Jamie Soward was a part of that regime under Wayne Bennett, which was get the ball down there. Let's see what they've got when they come back, and let's just try and get forced in the back, and we'll break their spirit. And that's what they did.
Best defensive team in the comp by a margin, but in the final 3 rounds of 2010, and they only lose one of the 3, but interestingly, they give up 32 points against Canberra in a loss, 18 in a win against the Knights, and then another 24 in a win against South. So maybe because they knew they were going to be minor premiers, they let their hair down a little bit. That's all well and good. They're minor premiers, first past the post. Dragons fans, they got their fingers crossed, saying, "Come on, please, this has to be it. This has to be the year." The big one for me, watching the highlights from the first qualifying final, Alby against Manly at Cogra.
Yeah.
They can't just win. I felt like they needed a big performance. Now they get up 24-0. Sorry, they're up 24-0. It's a big crowd at Cogra, 72nd minute. The game's in the bag, right? 72nd minute, 10 metres out from their own line, Soward spins it to Gaznia. Gaznia goes through T-Rex and he goes through Kieran Foran, runs around Ben Farah and scores. That's a big flex to say, right, we're into the prelim final, but we've done it with a bit of champagne footy. And they've done it, they look like a team on their way to the grand final. And I really like that they did that in the first week of the finals because, they could have gone to the game and said, you know what, let's just win this 5-4. Let's win it, 16-14. But they put it to Manly and gave it to them. And I thought that Gaznia try, whether rightly or wrongly they've discussed it since, I thought that was a big moment for them in their season.
The first time in a long time they went on with it and they protected their lead, and Manly were without anything at all. 0 points, nothing. And they were bundled out pretty much straight away. And St George, as you said, St George made a statement, but then the momentum of the Roosters was starting to come. And, with Brian Smith, who tidied up the Roosters, who I think were last the year before under Brad Fittler. And things just weren't going right for the Roosters. So Brian Fittler brings his experience straight to the ball, and they start to believe in themselves. And very easy possibility of a Cinderella story. And of course, is their in that amazing game, that amazing thing, one of the best semi-finals ever in front of. I don't think there was any spare sets. The Tigers up against the Roosters.
Yeah, I don't want to talk about that game.
Unbelievable game. Listen, the Tigers did everything. They
should have won 10 times.
And then they go up against St George the following week to play off for a game for a role in the grand final. And again, it was an incredibly good game of rugby league, and St George just got it over the line. But I up until that point, I still didn't believe that St George was going in. I thought the Tigers were going to do the same thing that happened in 2005.
Yeah.
And I can tell you, every single St George supporter that was there at the ground, and those that were watching in pubs, and those that were watching at home, were sitting on the edge of the six, counting down that clock when Soward finally gets the ball and kicks the field goal with a few minutes to go, and then they've got to defend their lead. And they hold on, and you thought, right, we've now got a great show.
That's what I wanted to bring up. And as a West Tigers fan, I thought this was a better team than 2005. As a West Tigers supporter looking at the West Tigers team, I thought they were more well-rounded. They were licking their chops from 2009, where Jared Hayne got them late in the year at the SFS. They went down to the Roosters in that game in the first week of the semis, that cracking game, 19-15. And I think the big one for West Tigers, on the other side of the jaw to the Dragons before they met in that prelim final, they went to Canberra in week 2. Now, if you remember, the ground at Canberra sold out in a couple of hours. There was lines, kilometres wrong to get into the game. It was pandemonium down there. if you were a Green Machine supporter, and somehow West Tigers got the win. And then you look at that team, you think you got Marshall, Farah, Ellis, Fafita, Lawrence, Takiri, Gibbs, Galloway, Hyington, Fulton, Murdoch, Masilla, who debuted in week 1 of the finals. And then I was there too, Alby. I'm pretty sure, cause your line dropped out for a second there, but 72,000 fans at ANZ, I was there. And I can tell you, to a man in the crowd, every single West Tigers fan said, we are going to beat the Dragons tonight. There was no doubt. We just thought we were going to win.
I'll tell you what, there was probably 60% of St George fans that thought you were going as well. And this is the thing is that St George's fans didn't believe because they'd seen it all before and they'd been promised it all before, but they could never deliver. And that night in the final minutes, when Sawa kicked the field goal, they delivered. And it was 2 great coaches, let's not forget as well. And both of these sides, I mean, you know, the Tigers side as well, they were on the cusp of going somewhere as well.
Yeah.
Who would have, had they won that, they would have played the Roosters.
I say this all the time. I reckon we would have smashed the Roosters in the grand final.
I think they would have beaten them.
Yeah.
We would have beaten them in the grand final. And I think that could have, you know, I think that's the year, that 2010 year is the year that really broke the Tigers' spine. And they've not done anything since then. I think they got in there in 2013, but we can talk about them another day. They're on the right track, but that's a story for another day.
Yeah, and look, another thing too, I truly think that soured field goal and the fact they held on for the last 7 minutes or whatever it was, I think this game, the prelim final, was the game that got them the premiership. And it sounds weird because I know they still had to show up and beat the Roosters the next week. But the second half, they were so good in the second half. It was kind of, they were going through the motions, and it was kind of like the jubilation of getting it right after 2 years. But when you look back at this prelim final, the West Tigers, they scored the first try through Lottie Takiri. And again, it's like you say about Dragons fans and this mental thing where, surely we can't. And there's all these mini hurdles throughout the year where they've got to overcome them, and they keep overcoming them. So the West Tigers, they go to the lead. Wayman crashes over. He loses the ball. Dean Young crashes over. He's held up. They finally go again through Jeremy Smith, and he rolls over and gets the try. It's a real game of grinding force, like an irresistible grinding force against an excellent attacking side. And right before halftime, Alby, another little hurdle for the Dragons. Fulton with the quick hands from about 10 metres out. He offloads. Robbie Louis goes under the post. And West Tigers lead at halftime. And again, another little hurdle. They're down 12-6. The Dragons go to the sheds. An old Dragons team, if they didn't have Wayne Bennett and he didn't bring these players with him and chisel them and get them ready for this, they may have crumbled again in the second half, but they didn't, did they?
No. Well, again, they were front runners, but Robert Louis that night was the Tigers' greatest asset, but also he did a couple of silly things which gave away some field position, which gave the Dragons a little bit more hope. But they held on, and that was one of the things, the defining moments. So, in that particular game, because, Tigers kept coming and they kept coming, and everyone was like, "No, please don't let this be 05." And, come 80 minutes, siren goes and St George are on their way to the grand final. And I just think the relief, it was more about a relief to get there than what it was to win. It was absolutely amazing. I can't begin to tell you. It was pandemonium. People were crying. I mean, I was up in the St George area. It was unbelievable. I can't begin to tell you. We were just thinking, oh my God, we're going to get it and we're going to win. We actually felt for the first time that we were going to win. Whereas I think in many of the other grand finals in the 90s, you're up against Brisbane. And even though I think in 93, we'd beaten Brisbane all year, come grand final, they'd found a weakness. Then, of course, you had 1996 when David Manson let Matthew Rich play on. But I think we just got there on the back of a bit of momentum. 99, a really good side, a superstar side. But Melbourne were one of these grinding sides under Chris Anderson, really played a different style of football.
Yeah.
But this time, and I remember writing that article, which you helped me as well, St George and 11. Well, 11 years after 1999, guess what? 2010. And, of course, they're in the grand final, and they're up against the Roosters, coached by Brian Smith, who'd gotten St George to 2 grand finals. And he hadn't won one yet. And this was his opportunity. And you look at that side in 2010, and you think, you know what? That's actually not a bad side. That's a pretty good side. And there weren't a lot of superstars because Brian Smith doesn't like that. but he had kids that were coming through and they believed in what they were doing. And I think he got their belief pattern right. And I remember the night on the Friday before, I actually felt that the Roosters were more relaxed. St George looked very tense. And I think a lot of people made mention of it because St George were in their little schoolboy jackets or whatever it was. The Roosters walked in and I honestly looked, I went, oh my God, I started to worry. I started to worry. And so I rang a few people that I know in the St George world and I went, I'm concerned. And they said, oh, don't be, you're going to be fine. I said, look at them. And then they started worrying and it was just a typical St George thing. The thing about what St George do, and we do it the best more than any other club, is we start second guessing ourselves and then we have doubt and then it's all over.
It's funny too that you bring up Brian Smith because this is something I did want to talk about. For years, Wayne Bennett versus Brian Smith. It started with Broncos versus Dragons, and then Smith went to Para, and then how many years there were these blockbuster Friday nights. Smith trying to outsmart Bennett, and Bennett, the old cowboy, sitting back saying, "Do your best, son." And then it comes full circle. Bennett's trying to get the Dragons the premiership that Smith couldn't get them, and Smith's there on the other side at the Roosters. I think I touched on it with Tony Priddle in a previous episode of Top of the Props, where Bennett and the Broncos may have played a few mind games before the 93 grand final and left a whiteboard with tip sheets of fake tips on what they're going to do with Dragons players and all the rest, which Tony Priddle called dirty pool, but it's a bit of sportsmanship, whatever. But then all of a sudden it's Bennett versus Smith again, and I think Paul Kent said on an episode of the Matty John show, he talks about the difference in demeanour between Bennett and Smith at halftime in the grand final, which the Roosters led 8-6. And he spoke about the fact that on one side, on the cameras, you've got Brian Smith going crazy on the whiteboard, giving the Roosters 400 different things to think about. Where Wayne Bennett walked into the dressing sheds, he crossed his arms and said, "Can you guys start playing like St George?" That was it.
And that was it. But an interesting stat at halftime, and I was at the grand final, and I was listening to Ray Hadley call the game, and I'd never really listened to Ray at a grand final, but I realised how good he was. It was fantastic.
He loves the grand final, Big Bolty.
Loves the grand final. He gets on the big stage and he goes great. But he said, here's the stat: the Roosters have had all the ball, 70% of this, and they've only scored 8 points. St George have only had 30% of the ball and they've scored 6 points.
Yep.
He said the moment St George start getting the ball again, the game will blow open. And that was his prediction. He had to leave to go off to the Olympics or something or other. He was waiting on a helicopter in the next oval to go to the airport, of course, as you do. And I think Andrew Moore brought it home. And it was absolutely great to listen to because you just got to see what was going on. But unfortunately, we were up the other end. I wasn't in the St George end this time. They were around the other side. And St George just started their grind back. And then the rain started to happen.
That's right. I was going to mention the rain. When did the rain start coming down?
Just after. It had rained most throughout the day. And I had these seats. And I said to my wife, I said, I don't know if we're going to go. She goes, we've got to go.
Yeah.
We've got to go. So we get there and we get out there and we wait for the last minute. We go out, get our beer, sit down. And I don't move for the whole day. And she said, I've never seen it. I mean, every St George supporter around me was just nervous. And then things started to happen in the second half. Because the first half was quite good. The rain had stopped and we got a bit of sunshine. But then it kicked and the rain kicked in the second half. And St George did what they always did best in that year. They held onto the ball. They didn't go too hard. They just kicked the ball down. They convinced the Roosters that they weren't going to win. Then the Roosters started to believe they could have won, made some silly mistakes. Brian Smith had blown their brains out at halftime, and that was the end of that.
Did you? I can't see you in a poncho, Alby, like with your Versace shirts and suit jackets and all the rest.
No. I had a Versace poncho. Like I had a very nice. It was very good. Don't worry, I looked good. I always look good. You know that. And it was. But and when Dean Young went over to score that try, and nothing short of amazing. Absolutely nothing short of amazing. And even though we were way ahead, that was the try that brought it home for me because, watching as a kid his father win the 1979 grand final and to see them hug on the big screen, every St George fan was crying. We were hugging Dean Young, we were hugging Craig Young. It was huge. I can't begin to, it was just massive. We'd waited so long, but it was just good to have it. I mean, I was 41. So I just celebrated my 40th or thereabouts and this happens. So it was just... I got a few texts from some mates and stuff like that, but it was just brilliant.
And you know what the Dragons reminded me of? Because Melbourne were a bit different because they brought in the wrestle and they brought in the jiu-jitsu and all the rest of it. And I guess all the other teams followed, which kind of fucked the game for a while. But when you look at the Dragons, I don't think they did as much of the wrestling. But what they did was they were only of a big python. And no matter what you did, once they grabbed you and they started squeezing, there was no way out. They
You know what? It's a very good analogy, and St George did that well. You know, I think they only lost 5 or 6 games throughout the year. I think it might have even been 7 actually, but they were, they were right up there in the high 30s. I think 38 with the buys. So they were right up there. They had the best defense. They had the best differential. The percentages were way off the charts. They didn't give away as many penalties. They worked with referees. Everything just seemed to roll. And it was a year, it was just absolutely magical, and the fact that, finally, after about 10 minutes, somebody, I don't know who was in charge of the DJ that day, they finally played St George's theme song, When the Saints, and it was just mental. And as soon as I sung that, I said, time for us to go. And it was brilliant. Went home straight away, watched it again on the TV and sat up all night, and it was brilliant.
The second half too, 26-0, you win 32-8. I think the Dragons averaged 12 against for the whole year. And when you think about what they did in the finals, no points against Manly. They hold West to 12. Now, 13-12, Dragons win. Roosters score 8 in the grand final. So, whatever Wayne Bennett does for the rest of his life, if he does win another premiership, he's chasing another premiership. We've already discussed this. But he was never staying that long at the Dragons. And when he did leave, there was no hard feelings because Wayne Bennett came in and did something that what Nathan Brown couldn't do, David Waite couldn't do, Andrew Farrer couldn't do. And then if you want to talk about before the merger, you go back through the 90s, I guess David Waite was there for a while. Brian Smith, obviously, and then back through the 80s as well. And, Bennett did something for the Dragons and their fans that he could have flicked the finger that night and said, see ya, I'm out tonight. And the Dragons wouldn't have cared because they had their title. Yeah.
And, they had the hangover the following year as well. But and they went very well. And then they had an injury. And unfortunately, they met up with Brisbane up in Suncorp and lost by Darren Lockyer field goal. And, I remember, I think it was Sportsbet or one of the betting agencies paid out. They pay out. They said, no one can beat this side. This side is unbelievable. I think the 2011 side was a little bit better than the 2010 side. They threw the ball around with more abandon again. But unfortunately, again, sometimes history repeats. Where they win, I think one year they'd won against the Tigers 13-12. They lost the following year by 13-12. And since then, not much has happened in the way of St George since 2011. I know that we've made the finals a couple of times, but it's been an incredibly disappointing, I have to say, almost decade. And it probably will be a decade before St George. It's been a lost decade, which is which is really quite sad. And the Tigers are the same, but both of them are starting to get their foundations right now. And I think with Tigers, ownership, coaching, getting a couple of these senior experienced players just to show the ones that you got coming through. St George, well, the ownership is sort of right. There's always going to be issues there. But I think they've got this coach, which again, like Wayne Bennett and like Roy Masters before him and David Waite as well, and even Andrew Farrer. I mean, Andrew Farrer did play for a little while, but had nothing to do with St George. They're going to bring these outside eyes in. The closest thing he's got to St George are his two assistants, who both played together, Peter Gentle, a Western Suburbs boy, as you well know, and Matthew Elliott, who I've always highly regarded, and his commentary. And, he did very well with both Canberra and both Penrith. Yeah. He did very well. And I think him being an assistant coach is perfect for him. So I'm trying to work out who's going to be the attack and who's the defence. I presume Gentle will be taking charge of some of the defence, and Elliott will be the attacking side of things. But I think that he's brought in a couple of old heads. He's respected the past, Griffith. That's a couple of really good appointments. But they just need to be fit. It's at the end of the day, the teams that are fit and the teams that can hold on, especially when they're injured, the teams that go through and they go on and win.
Look, as you know, Alby, before I moved out to Campbelltown, I was a Cogra boy or Hurstville boy, and family, all Dragons fans, lived in St George their whole lives, and I know what it was like, to respect and know the Dragons as one of the best teams in the comp year in, year out. And I think it's a bit sad that there's some kids from the new generation that kind of see the Dragons as this middle of the field, not heavyweight to the comp. But I hope for their sake that Dragons fans, that is, that they get back up there and get back up where they belong. But before we finish up, one more question for you, Albatross, and that is from the 2010 season. It can be officials, it can be admin, it can be the coaching staff or players. Who were the three most integral characters that got the Dragons the premiership in 2010? And that doesn't necessarily mean grand final day, but who were the three guys at the top of your head that turned it around and got the Dragons that premiership?
Bennett, Young, Hornby.
Yep, perfect.
That's it. They're the only three. And you'll see that both. The question is going to be, who's going to be an NRL coach sooner, Hornby or Young, coming through? That's going to be interesting to see. But those two in particular, they were just, Hornby was the captain, Young was the vice captain. Young controlled the forwards, Hornby controlled the backs. Bennett sent out the messages. Everyone knew what their job was. They listened, they learnt, and they did their job. And they learnt. They did it by respect, and no one dared question Hornby, and no one dared question Young, because Dab was around the club as well as football manager. So that helped, that bit of history. The one thing that Wayne Bennett did, which a lot of people probably don't know about, was he made sure all the old boys were a part of the process. So Wayne doesn't drink. He's never drunk. Right? He doesn't drink. But they've organised dinners and they organised, reunion. Wayne would rock up. So when they had a big reunion, and I'll tell you a funny story about a dear friend of mine, a guy called Kevin O'Sullivan. Kevin coached, the under-23s. He's the last person, I think, prior to Wayne Bennett to have won a premiership in any grade for St George. And they call him Jaffa. And he played for St George, but he blew out both his knees. And he became good mates with some of the old boys, your Billy Smiths, your Graham Langlands, great friends. Anyway.
He would have to be a good drinker if he's mates with them.
Oh, this is the story. The bloke's got hollow legs. I went for a shout with him once. I was going after 6 beers. He's still going after 16 beers. I had to get put in the back of a cab. I don't know how I got home, but they gave the bloke $100 and somehow I got home. That's all I know. But he was just, he rang me the next day. I go, where are you? He goes, I'm at the bowler. I said, of course you are. But that's the type of guy that he is. And his family, great St George people. And, but, there's a reunion on. So anyway, Wayne becomes mates with Jaffa. Well, Jaffa's a great coach as well, so he knows the game, and they find a kindred spirit. And he's this big, beer-swilling bloke up against a teetotaler. Big bloke with a big beer belly up against a skinny fella. But they've got a love of St George and a love of rugby league. So anyway, they've walked into this reunion, and everyone walks around, claps, because Wayne Bennett's walked in the room, and he knows that Jaffa wants a beer. He just knows, and he looked at Jaffa. He goes, "Give me your keys, Jaff." Goes, "Why?" He goes, "Just go and drink." He goes, "I know you want." He goes, "Oh, thanks, Wayne." Takes the keys. Now, Jaffa doesn't miss. Now, Jaffa's at a shout with 4 different people.
Yeah.
So there are 4 groups. He's in all of them. And they know, and he's finishing beer after beer, but, nothing touches the sides. The old stalwarts, these blokes. So he's got to go home. So how does he get home? Wayne drives him home.
Yeah.
Wayne takes the car back to his place and then goes and picks him up the next morning. That's Wayne Bennett.
Legend. Absolute legend. And I assume Wayne Bennett probably doesn't know the streets of Sydney as well as Brisbane. Oh,
not at all. And imagine a rolling drunk, a redhead rolling drunk called Jaffa, with Wayne Bennett. Probably going, "I'm sick of these nuisance blokes." But they formed a kindred spirit, and whenever they do see each other, they laugh. And you know what? That's to me rugby league, and you know that as well as I do. These blokes that have been around the game. Jaffa would have been a superstar. He wasn't. It wasn't to be. But he ended up being such a great club man for St George that what it did is it brought those old boys back together, so they all believed, they all sung from the same hymn book, and they all started to believe that they could win again after, really, we think about it, 31 years of disappointment.
That's beautiful, mate, and it's a great story to finish too. I want to thank you again, Alby, and you'll be back on soon, mate. Give us another plug for your podcast as well, but what is it? Yeah,
the Front Office. You can download it at all your favourite little app stores. It doesn't cost anything. You get it for nothing. If you've missed the episodes thus far, we've had about 18 of them. We've had Vonnie, Lara, Justin Pascoe, Blake Solly. We've had Marina Go. This week, we've got Lee Hanjavanthalas from the West Tigers, and we've got Andrew Moore. So look out for that one.
Amazing. Well, that is amazing.
Superstars come to Alby. I've been nominated, and I've been called now and christened the Parkinson of podcasts.
Oh, by it wasn't one A Talrico, was it?
It could have been. It could have been.
Thanks, buddy.
Thanks for joining. See you, mate.
See you, mate.